Hello, and I'm delighted to be back for our regular Sunday history series, looking at what we in the West euphemistically call the Silk Roads. And this week we're going to look at the territory that in the modern world is called modern-day Israel and the Jordan Valley, and encompasses parts of Syria, including the city of Damascus and the modern-day country of Jordan. But we're actually going to treat it as one territory, because this territory actually gives us a lot of lessons about the relationship between stability and instability. Now, in the last videos we looked at ancient Mesopotamia, and we looked at the emergence of the very first civilizations post-Ice Age, and we looked at the first city of Eridu, the biblical Eden, and we looked at the progression of this civilization as it kind of grew and grew more complex. And we focused particularly on the dynasty called the Third Dynasty of Ur, a period in this country's history, in this empire's history, known as the Neo-Sumerian Empire. Now, we identified the first monarch of the Third Dynasty of Ur as the man represented as Noah in the Bible, but that it was a slightly more flawed character than the one represented in the Bible. And we talked about the fact that these texts are about the transmission of history over a very long time in very short symbolic stories. And we also talked about the most successful monarch in this dynasty's history, a man called Shulgi of Ur, who occupies a very special role at the core of the Abrahamic faith, with the name Shem. Now, in this kind of territory, like, geography actually drives history. I keep saying this, but this is very true. This very small kind of patch of territory, which encompasses the Jordan Valley, actually links many distinct geographical territories. So it links the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. You can get down to Egypt through here. It also is linked to the Eurasian steppe, both the lowlands and the highlands. And what I'm going to describe is a political engine that actually emerges in antiquity following the period of Mesopotamian dominance described as kind of that is covered by the Third Dynasty of Ur. And I'm going to describe how the instability generated by the disintegration of the Third Dynasty of Ur leads to the establishment of a political engine which then goes on to stabilize not just what Christopher Beckwith in Empires of the Silk Road describes as the Eurasian culture complex, but actually territories as far as the Indus Valley, the west coast of Africa, Britannia, and northern Siberia in Russia. This is a huge amount of territory that this location sits in the center of almost exactly. Now, this territory is made up, at the center of it are some waterways. So you've got the Dead Sea, which is linked to the Sea of Galilee by the Jordan River. And to put it quite bluntly, like, I've tried to find another way to describe this, but if you look at this territory without modern boundaries on it, it kind of looks like a vagina, like it really does. And this has actually probably been noticed in antiquity. Now, in ancient Mesopotamian civilization, this is a very, very sacred place. This is where the salt water meets the sweet, and it actually has had significance for much further back than we are talking, right back to the depths of Mesopotamian civilization. But in the period that marks the end of Mesopotamian dominance, the end of the Third Dynasty of Ur, a political engine is established here, which actually recognizes the contested nature of this territory. And this is a territory that's been defined by almost constant conflict in the 2,000 years since this political engine ceased to function. And I'm going to kind of have a look at in this video. In the next video, I'm going to go through the history of the civilizations that are impacted by this political engine and the functions that it contains. But in this video, I'm going to discuss how it comes into being. Now, Shulgi of Ur is the most successful monarch in the Third Dynasty's kind of tenure. Under his tenure, by bringing back the power of the high priestesses that we discussed, who used the mountain bases along the Eurasian steppe as a system of kind of mediation and governance creating stability on these constantly warring city-states. He brings these back to the center of his governance, and this is reflected in his artifacts. It's under his tenure that we see the enactment of the Urnamu law code, the first kind of law code the first extant law code in history. We see a reorganization of the boundaries of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, and it's set up as districts, and we see legal training and civil service training, which actually become the foundation much later of the modern Torah. Now this is all really, really good, and this is all symptomatic of this system of governance that's actually kind of identified with these high priestesses that usually has a system of tribal federation at its core. But what undermines the third dynasty is that they make a mistake that successive empires and nations throughout history, including our own with the reflex to enact austerity after the financial crisis, make over and over again. And that's that in periods of instability, they start to rely on the superiority of their own identity and to otherize people who are contained within their boundaries and generate conflict and instability. Now, there are several peoples that I want to bring your attention to, because this is a period on the Fertile Crescent that is at the roots of many, many civilizations. And some of the names that I'm going to give you, they'll run into one another and you'll be like, I can't even keep up with this. But these are actually, I'm going to come back to each of them in subsequent videos, because each of these peoples is at the root of another civilization. So one of the key people to understand is the Elamites. Now the Elamites are at the roots of Iranian and Persian civilization, the very, very deep roots, and they are contained within the boundaries of what becomes the Neo-Sumerian Empire. Now it's actually the Elamites who ultimately sack the city of Ur and mark the end of the third dynasty and the instability generated by this dynasty. Another really important people to understand is the Amorites. Now the Amorites are actually native to the Levant itself, and they are at the center of a really important city where the ruins still exist on the border between Syria and Iraq, called Mari. Now Mari is a circular city. It's actually the city that the later kind of city of Baghdad is emulating. And at the core of Mari is the power of high priestesses and a dynasty whose skill lies in diplomacy and trade using marriage. So their daughters are very, very powerful, and they're married to various civilizations. There are actually daughters of kind of Mari kings who are married into the third dynasty itself. It's actually a daughter of a Mari king who's probably at the roots of the city of Babylon. And this city occupies a really important place as a place of trade and diplomacy, and it links to these other civilizations, and it's actually a stabilizer along the Fertile Crescent. Now the city that we are going to discuss that forms this political engine that stabilizes like this entire these massive territories from Britannia to Siberia, down to the Indus Valley, down to the west coast of Africa, for a very long time after, till the 1st century, is initially set up by Shulgi of Ur in an attempt to usurp this city of Mari, a lack of understanding of the role it plays in stabilizing the Fertile Crescent and trying to usurp it as a power base of his own. Now the city that he establishes is in a mountain fortress that becomes known as Kadesh, or Mount Sin, named after the dynasty. Like Sin is a name, his son is called Amar-Sin, and it's also the name of the moon goddess, and it also becomes known as Holy Mountain. Now the word holy is very, very interesting, and the reason it becomes initially known as Holy Mountain is after a goddess called Katesh. Now the root word of Kadesh is QDS, which is actually the Hebrew word which means holy. And she's very likely not to have been a goddess, but to have been the high priestess that Shulgi married, and also very likely to have been his sister and the daughter of Nama. And it's her that's venerated at this site. This is why it becomes known as Holy Mountain. At Mari, the city of trade and diplomacy, this circular city on the Iraq-Syria border, there is a temple of the winged lions in the ruins. One of the biggest monuments within the current ruins of Petra is actually the temple of the winged lions, and this refers back to an earlier belief system from Umar and Lagesh, and is actually the story of the winged lions is actually repeated as far away as the book of Daniel many eons later. Now, the expansion of the third dynasty of Ur basically generates massive conflict and instability along the Fertile Crescent. So while Shulgi of Ur is known as an enlightened king, he enacts this legal system that forms the foundation of the Torah, this law code, and he does all these things, and he puts the power of the high priestesses and this governance system based in the mountains back at the core of his governance. He also is guilty of very seriously otherizing people within this territory. So the Amorite kings at the core of this city of Mari, and the Elamites, who are at the core of Persian civilization, are a particular preoccupation. At one point, he tries to build a wall to keep the Amorites out, which actually has reminiscences in kind of modern day events. Now, over the course of the successive generations of the Third Dynasty, they lose territory very quickly. The districts that they have established rebel against them. Amar Sin, who is Shulgi's son, his death actually indicates that we're starting to see the impact of Egyptian civilization on the Fertile Crescent. The inscription about his death said, we thought it was the ox that was going to kill him. The ox is a euphemism for political change he's tried to enact, and it refers to him changing sacrificial practices, but the scorpion bit him on his foot. This indicates that the Scorpion King, who's the first king in Egyptian civilization, is very likely have had to somehow intervene to stabilize things here. This is a period of intense conflict that leads to the emergence of the first Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire kind of emerges in the city of Babylon as a direct reaction against this dynasty, the Third Dynasty of Ur. Their pantheon of gods replaces the moon goddess Sin and these female goddesses with Marduk, a male god. Their law code is a reflection of the Ur-Nammu law code. It introduces a patrician class and is much more brutal, but is also a very important stage in the actual history of the rule of law for the whole of civilization. Babylonian society continues to develop with a reaction against these high priestesses. It demonizes them as Lilith, the mother of demons. This is where we get the mythology about Lilith, and like the sacrificial practices and the practices around women in this society are a problem throughout its history. Now, the Babylonians actually expand up the Fertile Crescent, and initially they actually have alliances with Mari, but are ultimately responsible for Mari being decimated. And it's the conflict and instability that's generated by the instability of the Third Dynasty. After Shulgi has established this city, Kadesh, Mount Sin, in Jewish tradition this is Salem, the city of peace, that actually leads to the actual kind of consolidation of this city as a real city of peace under the stories of Abraham and Sarah. Now, Abraham and Sarah in the books of Genesis are incredibly important symbolic stories which give us tremendous insight into what has happened here. Now, the genealogies in Genesis, they start out originally with the Sumerian kings list, and then a new genealogy starts with the story of Noah and his family, which introduces 3 children, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. Now, Shem is Shulgi, and these are not actually likely to have been Naamah, the priestess, who is likely to have been Shulgi's mother's actual children. Ham is a very problematic term which means burnt faces, which refers to Egyptian civilization, and Japheth is likely to refer to the people that we later come to call the Scythians, who become the foundations of what we also call the Celts and European civilization. And what this genealogy is likely to refer to is the very roots of this city, Kadesh, that Shulgi has established. But in actual fact, during the tenure of Shulgi, he is in conflict with these civilizations, as well as these different civilizations on the Fertile Crescent. And the stories of Abraham and Sarah are the period where Ur falls, and where actually, like, what is described in the stories of Abraham is very likely to be a king called Sakiah, a Hyksos king, is a period where this power has to shift from Ur, and that, like, Abraham in Islamic tradition establishes the first Kaaba. This is likely to be at this city Kadesh, and what happens is a series of conflicts, marriages, and kind of political kind of maneuverings that allow a re-clarification of this kind of covenant that binds all these people in territories, and a new stage in Holy Covenant which learns from the disintegration of the city of Ur. Abraham has to take part in the War of the 5 Kings, which is actually referring to the instability of the Fertile Crescent. The Sakiyahar, he also has to, he marries a second wife, Hagar, who is a pharaoh's daughter. This is a political alliance. And it's actually the power of Hagar and Sarah, the last high priestess of Ur, and this pharaoh's daughter, which is described as being established at this city Kadesh, where the first Kaaba will be, that actually forms the foundation of this political engine, Salem, which goes on to shape antiquity. In the period which will be covered by Sakiyahar at the end of the third dynasty, Mari pretty much it comes up against the Babylonians, and the king of Mari, Zimri-Lin, who actually leaves an incredible literary legacy, he disappears off the face of the earth. The Temple of the Winged Lions appears at Petra, and the king Melchizedek, who gives authority to Abraham in the Bible, is likely to refer to him. In the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, this is about kind of unspeakable practices that are happening at these cities, likely involving children. And Abraham is required, he not only, he argues with God about whether there should be any survivors from Sodom, and argues that they should be tried at the city of Salem, thus embedding the rule of law at the center of governance systems. The binding of Isaac is about saying we will not indulge in child sacrifice. We will not take Sodom's dollar is another feature. The children of Moab and the story of Lot's wife becomes central. Lot's wife is a pillar of salt, a pillar of wisdom, and becomes indelibly associated with this site, Kadesh, and the areas around it, as a symbol in the text of the welfare systems that become kind of embedded here. The story of Hagar, the Pharaoh's daughter. A Pharaoh's daughter never got abandoned for a drink of water by her husband or married out that way. This is a political alliance, and she portrays the single mother in this text with her baby to represent the welfare functions that come to define this holy mountain, Mount Kadesh, Mount Sin, this Salem, the city of peace, as kind of learning from the disintegration of the third dynasty of Ur. Now, the political engine that actually comes to be established at Kadesh it requires the strip of land that comes to be called Canaan. And it's the relationship between these two lands and the separation of them within the text and the way that is projected to others that protects this political engine for a very, very long time. Now, what I'm going to have a look at in the next video, now we've looked at how this political engine comes into being, at the instability that generates the learning that means that these people understand that this is necessary in this contested strip of land, that there needs to be a power base here that is actually an engine for peace. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to outline the functions that are at the core of this city, Kadesh, that you can still see the ruins of at modern day Petra. The role that the strip of land that comes to be called Canaan and is in modern times Israel plays in protecting this site. And then I'm going to look at the area around the Jordan Valley and Israel and ask what this can teach us about the modern world, where the kind of tumult and conflict in this area now comes from. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to come back next week and I'm going to look at Egyptian history and Nubian identity and the formation of the Egyptian identity and the history of what we call the Nubians or the Ethiopian and the territories with a power center around Axum. And I'm going to look at the development of that civilization and its relationship to this kind of political engine that is established here. Thank you very much for sticking with me today. I'll be back for the next video, which I'm going to put up at the same time, and I'll see you next Sunday to discuss Egypt and Nubia.